It was supposed to be a day of joy, the kind of day that makes the wrinkles on my face soften into a smile. My only son, Jonathan, was turning 50. I woke up before sunrise, carefully wrapping the gift I had saved for months to buy. A handcrafted watch made by an artisan in Chicago. It cost me nearly $400. Money I had scraped together from my modest pension checks, and the few sewing jobs I still take to keep my hands busy. As I stood at his doorstep holding the small velvet box, I remembered the little boy who once ran into my arms with scraped knees, crying for comfort, and I felt my heart swell with anticipation. I knocked gently, imagining his surprised grin when he saw me. But when the door opened, his face was not filled with joy. It was painted with irritation, as if my very presence had ruined his morning. "Oh, Mother, what are you doing here so early?" he muttered, barely meeting my eyes. I stretched out my hand with the box, whispering, "Happy birthday, darling. I brought something very special for you." He sighed, a long, heavy sigh that stung more than any harsh word. "Mom, come inside," he said flatly, as though granting a stranger a reluctant favor. His house was bright and beautiful, bought with the down payment I had given him 12 years ago to $1,000 I had withdrawn from my savings when he married Claire. I had told myself back then it was worth every penny to see my son start life on solid ground. But now, sitting in his living room, I felt like an intruder. Jonathan didn't thank me for the gift. Instead, he sat across from me with his arms crossed and eyes cold. "I've been thinking," he began in a tone that made my skin crawl, "about what I really want for my birthday." I smiled nervously, ready to hear about a trip, or maybe a new gadget. "Tell me, sweetheart. Whatever it is, I'll try to make it happen." He leaned forward, and the words that fell from his lips sliced through me like glass. "What I really want is for you to stop existing in my life, for you to die, Mother." I froze. The air left my chest, and the room seemed to spin. I had birthed him, nursed him, sacrificed every dream I ever had so that his future would be brighter than mine. And now, with a face colder than winter, he told me my death would be a gift. "Jonathan, how could you say such a thing?" I whispered, tears clouding my vision. He didn't flinch. "I'm exhausted, Mom. Exhausted from your constant calls, your visits, your dependence on me. I can't breathe with you hovering over me. My life would be easier if you were gone." My trembling hands clutched the box still unopened, the watch ticking inside as if mocking the years I had counted in sacrifice. For 82 years I had lived, 50 of them as his mother, and never had I imagined this moment. "I am your mother," I stammered. "I've given you everything I had." He stood, towering over me with disdain. "Exactly. You gave everything, and in return you've shackled me with your presence. I want freedom. I want peace." My legs felt weak as I rose, carrying the gift that now seemed foolish. "I just want to be part of your life," I pleaded softly. His reply was merciless. "That's the problem. You are my whole burden. Find a life of your own. Leave me alone." As I walked to the door, I turned back one last time, searching his face for a trace of the boy who once called me his hero. But all I saw was impatience, a silent demand for me to disappear. "Happy birthday, Jonathan," I whispered. I closed the door behind me, stepping out into the cold air, not knowing that this moment would awaken something inside me that had slept for decades, something that would change both our lives forever. I made my way back to the little flat I'd lived in for years, the kind of place where every chair has a story, and every scratch on the table remembers a laugh. The watch lay heavy in my bag, its velvet box bumping against my hip like a small, accusing heart. I sat down on the same sagging couch where I used to stitch tiny hems while humming lullabies, to a small boy who believed the world was as kind as his mother's hands. The apartment smelled like the tea I'd brewed ginger and lemonade for a long time. I just listened to the sound of the kettle cooling, as if ordinary noises could stitch the world back together. But the words kept coming back. Relentless. "I want you to die." I pulled out an old shoebox from beneath the bed receipt, face-faded birthday cards, clinic slips from times when he was sick as a child, scrapbooks filled with photographs of faces that smiled when I smiled. I began to sift through them, not out of nostalgia, but because I needed a map, a ledger of everything I had poured into his life. When Jonathan was little and had a bad fever, I remember walking to the pharmacy with trembling arms, buying the medicine that the clinic's program didn't cover. It cost me what felt like a fortune then, $600, but what mattered was the look on his face when the fever broke. Years later, when he wanted a suit for his graduation party, I worked extra nights hemming dresses and making small alterations for neighbors. And I paid $40 for a second-hand suit that made him stand taller. In college, when he switched majors 3 times and the tuition bills stacked up, I took on a small upholstery job that kept my fingers raw and my nights short. I put aside $32,000 over time so he could finish what he'd started. When he married Claire, I insisted they have a modest celebration, but still covered the reception so their friends could dance without worry. $20,000 that came from a mix of odd jobs and the little nest egg I'd kept safe for emergencies. And the house that now felt like a stranger's fortress, was partly my doing too. I'd signed for their down payment years ago. $75,000 taken from the account I'd meant to use for slow, peaceful afternoons, for train trips and afternoon tea in places I'd never seen. I reminded myself of the nights I stayed up until dawn patching seams to make ends meet. Of the afternoons I skipped a meal so the twins could have something fresh. Of the time I quietly paid the electrician when a light went out at their home so the children could study without shadows. When I added it all up in that cramped kitchen with a pencil and a trembling hand, the numbers made a noise like a storm. The total wasn't astronomical compared to those who inherit fortunes. Still, it represented everything I had chosen to give. Roughly $257,000 spread over a lifetime of choices made in his name. I thought about compound interest for a moment, not because I'd turned my life into a spreadsheet, but because I wanted to understand the scale of what I'd traded. If I had let those savings sit, if I had said no once or twice, if I'd kept a corner of my life for myself, perhaps I would be living differently now. Calmer days, a small garden, visits to a sister I hadn't seen in years. Instead, my currency had been time, presents, stitched clothes, warm meals left on their doorstep, rides to school when the car failed, and quiet loans paid back in hugs that had grown thinner with time. Sifting through the evidence of my devotion, I felt a peculiar mix of grief and clarity. The sorrow was sharp as the needle I used to sew, and it burned with a lifetime of tenderness that felt suddenly foolish. But underneath that sorrow something steadier was forming, a resolve that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with dignity. I found the little folder where I kept copies of documents, weeding receipts, the mortgage agreement with my signature tucked at the back, the note from the time I covered several months of payments when Claire's hours were cut. My heart beat against those papers as if to remind me that every sacrifice had a trail, a paper trail that could be followed if I chose. I sat for a long time looking at my hands, the veins like soft maps, and realized that the life I'd given away was built on agreements and promises. If those agreements had a clause that protected me, perhaps it was time to read them with clear eyes. I reached for the phone and dialed his number, not because I hoped for an apology, but because I needed confirmation one more time that what I'd heard at the door was not a cruel mistake. After the third ring, his voice answered, terse and impatient. "Yes, Mother. Did you mean what you said?" I asked, keeping my voice steady though it shook inside. His answer was clinical, devoid of warmth. "I meant it. I'm not asking you to help anymore. I need my boundaries." He hung up. The line went dead, and something quiet and resolute settled over me. The tears came, but they were joined now by a different current, quiet, practical. If he wanted me to disappear, I would do something he had never imagined. I would step into a life I had postponed for decades, and I would not do it out of spite. I would do it to teach myself how to be whole again. I moved through the week like a woman possessed by quiet purpose. Grief had folded into a kind of methodical fever, and every small errand felt like laying a stone in the foundation of a life I was finally building for myself. First stop was the little branch of the bank where I had kept a joint safety cushion for my son's emergencies, a fund. I had fed with deposits over the years, money set aside with the best intentions. The teller, a kind-faced woman named Rosa, recognized me and smiled, but I could see the surprise when I asked to close the joint account on the spot. "Mrs. Carter," she said gently, "are you sure? That account has close to $15,000. I nodded. I had decided the money would be better under my own name. Pockets of autonomy matter when you've spent most of your life tucking yourself into someone else's future. Signing the forms felt like exhaling for the first time in a long season. The clerk handed me the cashier's check and the paper that said the joint access had been revoked. The weight of the envelope in my bag was small and strangely exhilarating. From the bank, I walked to the municipal mortgage office, a place I had only visited in passing before. Years ago, I had signed as a guarantor for the little house where Jonathan and his family lived in, arrangement born from love and a belief that helping would always be the right answer. That paper, I had discovered, was not just a promise. It was a legal instrument with edges I had never bothered to examine. The loan officer, a practical woman with sharp glasses named Ms. Nguyen, opened the file and explained my standing. As a cosigner, I had both obligations and remedies. If the primary payers demonstrated instability or significant arrears, I could, under certain circumstances, assert rights to the property or push for remedies that protected my contributions. Hearing the precise language default, recourse, remedies was sobering but empowering. There was a leverage that came with paperwork, a path forward that did not depend on apologies or change of heart from my son. I left with photocopies of the mortgage, a list of notices that would be considered evidence, and a sense that the house that once felt like shelter for my giving might now be part of a reclaiming, not in malice, but in safeguard. Next I visited my longtime attorney, Ms. Carter, an older woman with an exacting mind and a soft laugh who had known my family for decades. I told her everything: the words at the door, the receipts in my shoebox, the shame and the sudden clarity. She listened without judgment, and then began, with professional steadiness, to redraw the map of my affairs. We reviewed my will, my life insurance, the beneficiary designations on policies, and the account directives. I asked to remove Jonathan as a primary beneficiary and to set up a trust for the children with strict conditions, the funds accessible only when they reached 30 years of age, by which time perhaps their judgment and gratitude would have had space to grow. We discussed redirecting a significant portion of what would have been his inheritance to a community center I had volunteered at 4 years, a place that fed elders and taught sewing to young mothers. The paperwork was meticulous and felt like a seal being placed on an era. Change of beneficiaries, power of attorney updates, notices to insurers. Ms. Carter warned me about the emotional fallout, but I had already felt that. What I needed now was legal clarity. By the time I walked out of her office, it was late afternoon, the light thin and honest, and a small steadiness had settled into my chest. I had always been a giver, but I had never before considered giving to myself in ways that required forms and signatures. Today I had begun. I woke the next morning with a strange electricity humming in my bones, the kind that comes not from youth but from finally daring to do what you should have done years ago. For the first time in decades, my calendar wasn't about someone else's needs. It was about building the scaffolding of my own freedom. I brewed coffee slowly, savoring the steam rising from the chipped mug, and then pulled out the papers from the day before. The stack was thick: bank documents, mortgage copies, revised beneficiary forms. I laid them across my table like puzzle pieces, and as I looked over each one I realized they weren't just paper, they were the visible lines of a new architecture. I was drawing for myself. My mind drifted back to the countless mornings I had spent stitching hems or balancing ledgers for Anchana Singh's tuition, or staying awake to soothe crying grandchildren. Those mornings had trained me to endure. This new morning was training me to let go. I dialed the number of a travel agency whose brochure had sat pinned to my corkboard for years. It was one of those glossy flyers I had taken from a church fair, advertising trips for retirees who wanted to live abroad. The voice that answered was bright and professional. "Good day, Senior Horizons Travel. How may I help you?" I steadied my breath. This is Mrs. Carter. I'd like information about long-term stays in Portugal. Portugal had been a dream of mine since I was a girl, enchanted by stories of tiled streets and fado songs that curled like smoke into the night. As the agent described packages, costs, and residency options, I scribbled notes furiously, my heart thumping with every possibility. I asked about health coverage, local communities, and volunteer programs. By the end of the call, I had an email waiting in my inbox with itineraries and pricing. The cheapest option was nearly $5,000 for 3 months in Lisbon, with support to extend the stay. I closed my eyes and pictured myself on cobblestone alleys with sunlight on my shoulders, anonymous, free, alive. That afternoon, I withdrew $20,000 from my savings, requesting it in cash. The teller gave me a look of concern, but I smiled and told her it was for a personal project. I slid the bills into an envelope and tucked it into the small fireproof safe in my bedroom. For years, my money had been a tool for others: braces, mortgage payments, emergency groceries. Now it was a seed I would plant in soil of my choosing. Evening came, and with it a knock on my door. It was my neighbor, an old friend named Lucille, a widow with kind eyes, who often shared meals with me when loneliness pressed too close. She stepped inside, balancing a pie, and looked at me curiously. "You look different," she said, lighter somehow. "What's going on?" I hesitated, then poured us both tea and told her everything: Jonathan's words, my decisions, the accounts I had closed, the will I had rewritten, the plans for Portugal. She gasped, then pressed her hand over mine. "My dear, I've watched you give and give, until there was nothing left for you. Maybe this is the gift you should have given yourself long ago." We sat there until late, and for the first time in years I laughed freely, the sound startling in my own ears. When Lucille left, I sat at the table again, pen in hand, and began drafting a letter to Jonathan. It wasn't a letter of rage, but of reckoning. I wrote each word slowly, telling him that he had asked for my disappearance, and that I would grant it not with death, but with life lived elsewhere. I listed sacrifices not to shame him, but to show him the map of what had been given. And then I explained every change: the revoked accounts, the redirected inheritance, the trust for the children, the withdrawal of my support. "You said life would be easier without me," I concluded, "but you may discover it will also be more expensive, more demanding, and perhaps lonelier than you ever imagined." Folding those pages, I felt something powerful, not revenge, but the dignity of finally being seen, even, if only on paper. The weekend that followed felt like the rehearsal of a quiet revolution. I moved with a purpose that surprised even me: small, decisive actions stitched together into a plan I knew would be remembered. First, I spoke again with Lucille, asking her if she would be willing to be my ally in a way most neighbors never are. She did not hesitate. "Of course," she said, as if she had been waiting for me to say the words she already believed. We agreed on the details. She would discover my empty flat and find the note I would leave. She would call my son only after she had read everything, so the shock would be undeniable and immediate. The planning felt strange and a little wicked, but it tasted of self-respect, and that flavor was intoxicating. I also made a small list of things I would take with me: practicalities more than luxuries, a warm coat, a few dresses, a stack of photographs I wanted to keep, my late husband's watch, and the envelope with the cash for Portugal. I took care to fold each item neatly, as if each fold were a closing of a chapter, and a careful promise to myself that I would not return to the pattern of being only a giver. There were errands that required courage of a bureaucratic sort: notifying the pension office of an address change, arranging for health paperwork to be accessible abroad, and setting up a temporary forwarding address. I felt younger handling forms than I had in years, as if the act of naming myself in records and checklists gave me permission to exist outside my son's timeline. I also paid a visit to my seamstress client, a woman who had become a friend after years of mending prom dresses and little hems. I told her simply that I was going away for a while, and she hugged me like she understood without questions. When I left her shop, A soft piece of fabric tucked into my bag, a small comfort to sew into my new life. On Thursday morning I woke early and wrote the final lines of the letter I planned to leave on the kitchen table. Precise, calm, and unapologetic. I explained that his request had been heard and honored in a way he had not intended. That I was not ending my life but choosing to begin one that had been postponed for decades. I listed the practical changes I had made: accounts closed, beneficiary updates, the trust for the children with access delayed until they were 30 items stated plainly so there would be no ambiguity. Then, because a life cannot be reduced to ledgers alone, I wrote a page recalling small moments I cherished. The sound of his laughter the day he first rode a bicycle without training wheels. The way he fell asleep on my lap during thunderstorms. The ridiculous hat he wore to his cousin's wedding that made everyone laugh. The letter balanced the ledger with memory. It was a map of why I had once given so much and a signpost for why I could no longer continue to do so without reciprocity. That evening, just before midnight, I packed the last suitcase. I placed the watch I'd bought for Jonathan, now heavy with new meaning, inside a small velvet pouch and slid it into the bottom of my bag. I dressed in a comfortable coat and locked the flat, leaving a small key hidden in the flower pot on the balcony for Lucille to find as a clue that I had left intentionally. Before I slipped into bed for a few hours of restless sleep, I set my phone to airplane mode and placed it face down on the nightstand. The quiet in the apartment felt full of possibility rather than hollow. When Lucille would find the letter and the envelopes and read the lines I had written, she would know I had chosen to step away. I slept in short bursts that night, my thoughts a soft hum between grief and freedom. And when dawn came, I felt as if I had already begun to live in the way I had secretly imagined for years. The morning of my departure arrived with a sky the color of pale ash, as though the city itself were holding its breath. I rose before the sun, bathed slowly, and dressed in my best navy blue dress, the one with soft fabric that flowed easily when I walked. I had chosen it deliberately, not as armor, but as a declaration that even in the final chapter of one life and the opening lines of another, I would carry myself with dignity. I brewed tea, sat at the kitchen table, and gazed at the folded letter resting there, sealed in an envelope with Jonathan's name carefully written across it. Next to it lay the folder of documents, each one a testament to years of sacrifice and weeks of preparation. I traced the letters of his name with one finger, not out of regret, but out of recognition that this was the last offering I would leave him, the truth, unvarnished and undeniable. When I finished my tea, I placed the cup in the sink, wiped the table clean around the envelope, and whispered a quiet prayer for strength. The taxi arrived just as the city began to stir. The driver, a kind man with salt in his beard, loaded my suitcases into the trunk without questions. As we drove through streets I had walked for decades, I felt a mixture of melancholy and exhilaration. The bakery where I had bought sweet rolls for Jonathan's school lunches. The library steps where he once sat with a comic book while I worked a double shift. The church steps where I lit candles when I feared I had nothing left to give. All of them passed by my window like fading photographs. I pressed my hand against the glass, not in longing but in farewell. For too long, I had been stitched to this city by obligations that had left little room for joy. Now, at 82, I was leaving with the quiet determination of someone who finally understood that time is not a gift to squander. At the airport, the lines were long but my spirit was light. I clutched my passport and the ticket to Lisbon, a one-way flight that felt like a lifeline. I moved through security, found my gate, and settled into a chair with my suitcase at my feet. Around me were travelers of all ages, some weary, some excited, all of them moving towards somewhere new. I was just another face in the crowd, and the anonymity was delicious. No one there knew me as Jonathan's mother, as the woman who gave everything until there was nothing left. They knew me only as a fellow traveler, a woman with silver hair and steady eyes, waiting for her flight. I pulled out a small notebook and began sketching what I wanted for my new life. Mornings in markets with baskets of fresh bread. Afternoons volunteering at a community kitchen. Evenings sitting in a quiet room with music floating through the window. They were simple dreams, but they were mine. As the boarding call sounded, I stood and walked toward the gate. Each step felt like the shedding of an old skin. I thought of the letter Lucille would soon deliver, of Jonathan reading words he never expected to see. Perhaps he would feel anger, perhaps disbelief, perhaps eventually remorse. But none of those emotions belonged to me anymore. My duty was finished, my sacrifices accounted for. What lay ahead was not vengeance but renewal. When the plane lifted into the sky, I looked out the window and watched the city shrink into patterns of light and shadow. Tears rolled down my cheeks, not of sorrow, but of release. I whispered to myself, "This is the beginning," and for the first time in a lifetime, I truly believed it. When the plane touched down in Lisbon, the air that rushed in through the open cabin doors was unlike any I had breathed in years. It carried the scent of salt from the sea and faint traces of roasted chestnuts sold in carts outside the terminal. My legs trembled as I stepped into the airport, not from weakness but from the realization that I had truly done it. I had crossed an ocean into a future that was mine alone. Collecting my suitcases, I followed the signs until I stood before the wide glass doors. And when they slid open, the city unfolded before me like a waiting book. The sky was a dazzling blue, and the tiled pavements glittered under the sun, as though they had been laid there to welcome me personally. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of a small guest house near Alfama that the agency had arranged for my first month. As the car wound its way through narrow streets, I stared in awe at the pastel-colored buildings with their wrought-iron balconies, laundry fluttering like flags of ordinary lives. For the first time in decades, my mind was not filled with calculations of what my son needed or how to stretch a dollar. It was alive with curiosity. The guest house was modest but warm, with whitewashed walls and a little terrace that overlooked rooftops tumbling toward the river. I unpacked slowly, hanging my dresses in a wardrobe that smelled faintly of cedar, and placed the envelope of money into the small safe the innkeeper had provided. That evening, I sat on the terrace with a glass of local wine, watching the sun dip into the Tagus River, painting the water with strokes of gold. I thought of Jonathan and the letter waiting on his table back home. By now Lucille would have found it, and the silence on his end of the phone, the sudden absence of the woman he had taken for granted, would be settling in like a shadow. Perhaps he was angry, perhaps defiant, but it no longer mattered. My heart beat not for his reaction, but for the new rhythm of my own beginning. The days that followed became a gentle routine of discovery. I walked the cobblestone alleys, listening to the echo of my own footsteps, and marveled at how light I felt carrying only my own story. I visited the bustling markets where old women bargained over olives and bread, their laughter ringing through the stalls. I took the tram up steep hills and let the city reveal itself from new heights, terracotta rooftops stretching as far as the eye could see. On the third day, I found a small community center offering Portuguese lessons for newcomers. I signed up without hesitation, scribbling my name onto the roster with a thrill that felt almost childlike. Learning the language felt like planting roots into soil that might one day feel like home. Evenings were my favorite. I would return to the terrace, light a small candle, and write in the journal I had brought with me. In those pages I recorded not just the places I saw, but the feelings that had long been silenced. I wrote about the joy of choosing a meal based on what I wanted rather than what was cheapest. I wrote about the relief of sleeping through the night without the dread of a phone call asking me to rescue someone else's crisis. I wrote about the astonishing sensation of walking through a crowd and being no one's mother, no one's provider, just a woman with silver hair and a steady stride. Freedom had a texture I could feel on my skin, and it softened the ache of betrayal that still lingered. One evening, as I listened to fado music spilling from a nearby tavern, I closed my eyes and let the melancholy beauty of the songs wash over me. The lyrics, though I barely understood them yet, spoke of longing and loss, but also of resilience. I realized then that my story was not one of endings, but of transformations. I had not come here to disappear, as my son had cruelly wished, but to reappear to myself. For 82 years I had lived within the borders of obligation. Now I was crossing into a new map, and every step was mine to choose. The first real tremor from home arrived on my 5th morning in Lisbon. Folded inside a polite email from Ms. Carter with a scanned letter attached. Formal notice that the beneficiary changes had been executed. The trust for the grandchildren had been funded with conditions that delayed access until their 30th birthdays. And acknowledgement from the insurer that all designations now reflected my new wishes. There was also a note that the mortgage servicer had logged my prior guarantor payments as evidence should any dispute arise, and that a 36-day cure window would apply if arrears developed. I read it all in the quiet of the terrace, the river winking below as if it understood the language of thresholds. My phone, which I had kept mostly on silent, flickered with missed calls and messages bearing Jonathan's name, then Claire's, then unknown. I let them sit like unopened packages while I went about my morning Portuguese verbs with the other beginners at the community center. A slow walk past a stall where an old man sold oranges and stories with the same generous hands. An hour in the library reading about the city's earthquakes and how it rebuilt itself with a grid that invited more light. In the afternoon, a voicemail finally found me. Jonathan's voice, thinner than I remembered, asking if I had lost my mind, demanding explanations, veering between anger and a child's confusion. "You can't just cut us off," he said, the last word faltering. I listened only once, pressing my palm flat against the wood of the table until the ache in my hand steadied me. I wrote his number on a slip of paper, folded it twice, and tucked it into the back of my journal. A reminder that love can be a memory without being a leash. The next day, I took a volunteer shift at the community kitchen attached to the center. My station was aprons and spoons, which seemed fitting, tying things that hold, handing out things that serve. A young woman named Amara stood beside me, her Portuguese better than mine, her English tinged with a melody from farther south. She told me about the night boat that brought her family in, about a grandmother who taught her that a stitch can hold even when the fabric is tired. We fell into a rhythm without too many words. She knotted aprons. I checked pockets for stray coins. We both laughed when a spoon clattered to the tile like a rebellious cymbal. When the lunch crowd flowed in, I carried trays and felt the familiar ease of taking care, except this time, the care was offered to strangers who owed me nothing and to whom I owed nothing in return. It was the cleanest kind of giving I had ever known. That evening, Lucille's message flashed across my screen at last. A simple delivered followed by a longer note describing how she had found the letter exactly as planned, how Jonathan had arrived later. Breathless and bewildered, how he had read the first page slowly, and the second faster, and the third not at all. His mouth hard, his eyes doing the math of a life he had never counted. "He asked where you were," she wrote, "and I told him you were somewhere safe. Learning to breathe for yourself." I set the phone down and cried softly, not from guilt, but from the rawness of choosing myself so late that it felt like a birth. By the end of the week, the city had begun to knit itself into me. I learned to order coffee the way locals do. I bought a small blue scarf from a woman who said the dye came from stories. I found a bench where the afternoon light made even my hands look young. In class, our teacher asked each of us to describe our first home in 3 sentences. My turn came, and I spoke of a kitchen with peeling paint and a radio that refused to die, of a boy who believed pancakes could solve everything, of nights when I sewed until my fingers hummed. The room was quiet for a breath, and then someone tapped the table in that gentle European way of clapping, and I felt seen without being named. Later, I stopped in a tiny shop that repaired timepieces and showed the watch I had meant for Jonathan to the owner, a woman with a jeweler's loop and a poet's patience. "This is a fine piece," she said, turning it in her careful hands. "It should be worn." I laughed, surprised by the thought, and for the first time I fastened it around my own wrist. The tick was steady, unashamed of keeping my time. That night the messages from home took a new tone. Claire wrote that her schedule as a museum archivist had been cut back, that the twins' extracurriculars would need to be trimmed, that she wished we could talk without Jonathan in the room. I stared at the screen and typed a single reply: "I am safe. The children's trust is secure. Please take care." It was both too little and exactly enough. I set the phone face down, and opened my window to let the city's music in. The moon rose late, pale and precise, and I understood that resilience is not a thunderclap but a metronome, quiet, relentless, and faithful to the next beat. The days turned into weeks, and the city began to cradle me with a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. I learned which cobblestone alleys stayed sunlit longest in the afternoon, which baker woke earliest to set out the warmest bread, which church bells told not just the hours but the heartbeats of the neighborhood. I carried my little notebook everywhere, scribbling down Portuguese words alongside scraps of memory, weaving my past and present into a fabric that no longer frayed at Jonathan's name. Yet even as I stitched myself into Lisbon, the echoes of home arrived, relentless as tides. Letters came forwarded by Lucille, one scrawled in Jonathan's hurried hand, alternating between fury and pleading. Another, softer, written by Claire, confessing that she had underestimated the weight I bore all those years, asking if there might be a path back to forgiveness. I read them both carefully, then folded them and tucked them into the same drawer as the shoebox receipts I had brought across the ocean, not to dwell on, but to remember that love without respect corrodes faster than paper in rain. On a gray Tuesday, I received an email from Ms. Carter again. This time it wasn't about documents or policies, but about Jonathan himself. He visited my office, she wrote, angry at first, then subdued. He asked if legal actions could be reversed. I explained that changes were binding, though you could choose to amend them later. He left quieter than he arrived. I pictured him pacing the polished floor, his voice rising, then collapsing into silence. A part of me, the part that had once run to him with medicine, or patched his torn clothes, wanted to soften. But the larger part knew this silence of his was not yet repentance. It was the stunned cry of a man who had finally discovered that his mother was not in I closed the email and stepped onto my terrace. Rain had begun to fall lightly, and I let it touch my face. For decades, storms had meant fear of leaks in roofs, fear of bills unpaid, fear of a child catching cold. Now the rain was just rain. It cleansed without demanding. By the end of the month, I had woven myself into the life of the community kitchen, where I now helped with both the meals and the classes for young mothers learning trades. I found myself teaching them small stitches, the way to turn scraps into strong seams, the kind of practical art that had once kept Jonathan's shirts neat for school. They listened, wide-eyed, not because I was their mother, but because I was a woman with skills worth sharing. At night, I would return home with sore fingers and a heart strangely full. Giving here felt lighter, unchained from obligation. No one assumed it. No one demanded it. I gave because I chose to, and in that choice was a freedom more nourishing than rest. One evening, Amara asked me why I had left America. I smiled and told her the truth in simple words, because sometimes love becomes a cage, and if you wait too long, you forget how to fly. She touched my hand and said, "Then may your wings always be strong." I went to bed that night with tears on my pillow, not from grief but from gratitude that someone understood without needing the details. Still, the phone did not stay silent. Jonathan's messages shifted like weather, sometimes harsh winds of accusation, sometimes weak drizzles of guilt, sometimes rays of longing that peeked through. I read fewer of them each week. When I did, I replied with brief sentences, calm, clear, without apology. "I am well. Please take care of your children." Nothing more. I wanted him to know I was alive but no longer his servant, no longer the well he drew from without ever refilling. My strength grew each time I pressed send. One afternoon, Claire herself called. I hesitated, then answered. Her voice was worn, like paper folded too many times. She spoke not of Jonathan, but of the twins. "They miss you," she said softly. "They ask why Grandma doesn't come anymore." My throat tightened, but I steadied myself. "Tell them I love them," I replied. "Tell them I am giving them a future, even if they don't understand it now. And one day, when they are older, the trust will help them. But for now, I must live my own days." There was silence on the line, then a quiet sob. "I understand," Claire whispered. We ended the call with no promises, but with a fragile thread of truth stretched between us. That night, I sat by the window, the watch ticking on my wrist, and realized I had finally kept something for myself without shame. I was not just surviving, I was becoming. The weeks slipped gently into months, and Lisbon no longer felt like a place I was visiting, but a place that had welcomed me as its own. I had become part of the morning market chatter, the rhythm of the trams, the music that floated out of open tavern doors at night. My steps grew surer on the cobblestones, my tongue learned to form new words, and my heart learned to live without waiting for Jonathan's approval. I had spent more than 8 decades measuring my worth by how much I could give, and now, in the quiet glow of my remaining years, I measured it by how much I could finally be. Letters from home continued to arrive, some angry, some sorrowful, some desperate. I read them with compassion but without surrender. I knew now that forgiveness does not mean returning to the cage. It means releasing the weight so you can continue walking. My days were filled with teaching stitches to young mothers, serving meals to strangers, who quickly became friends, and writing long entries in my journal about freedom, dignity, and the courage it takes to begin again at 82. There were nights when the ache of memory crept in, a birthday candle from long ago, the sound of Jonathan's laughter as a boy, the warmth of his small hand in mine. Those memories did not vanish, nor did I wish them to. They were proof of the love that once existed, the love that guided me even when it was taken for granted. But memory was no longer my master. It was simply a guest that visited, stayed a while, and then left me to the life I was building. When I walked along the river and saw the water catching the sunset, I no longer thought of what I had lost, but of what I had finally claimed. My own presence, my own choices, my own story. At last, I understood that disappearing from his world had not been an ending but the most powerful beginning of my own. And now, dear listener, I turn to you. If my story has touched your heart, if it made you reflect on the sacrifices, the betrayals, or even the hidden strength that lives inside you, I ask you to stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, not just to hear my voice again, but to be part of a family that listens, that learns, that lifts one another up. Share in the comments the stories that have shaped you, the struggles you endured, the moments when you had to choose yourself, or the lessons you carry from the paths you've walked. Tell us what you felt while hearing this journey, what it made you think about, and what you discovered within yourself. This community is not built on judgment but on compassion, and your voice is as vital as mine. So join us, write your truth, and let us grow together. Because even when the world tells us we are too old, too tired, or too broken, here we know the truth. Our stories are still alive, and they have the power to heal.